This is BreakPoint This Week, a weekly briefing on faith, culture, worldview, and mission with John Stonestreet, president of the Colson Center for Christian Worldview.
Welcome to another edition of BreakPoint This Week. I'm Shane Morris, here with John Stonestreet to explore the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. John, we've got some tough issues to get to this week, just tough stuff to talk about. And one in particular, as we record this, several cities are reeling from protests, which in Minneapolis at least, have turned violent and even deadly. And all this outrage is over the killing of another unarmed black man by police officers. We saw an incredibly disturbing video earlier this week of an officer actually kneeling on George Floyd's neck beside his squad car while he begged the officer to stop and repeatedly told him for several minutes that he couldn't breathe. And John, this is just a tragic story all around, and one that has brought out deep feelings for millions of Americans.
It's horrible. And, one of the things that we have seen is if you go back to, for example, what happened in Ferguson a couple years ago, it escalated over a period of several days into some pretty intense rioting. We saw the same thing in the city of Baltimore. This in Minneapolis escalated really quickly. And I think it's probably due to a number of things. The mental and emotional stress of kind of being on COVID lockdown is probably not a good factor in all of this. But there's also a level of frustration. There's also this too, Shane, which is worth mentioning, that even you and I just a few weeks ago talked about the Ahmaud Arbery case, in which an unarmed 17-year-old African-American student football player was basically tracked down by a father-son duo and a third person who's now actually been charged with murder since you and I talked about this, with guns, trying to do something called a citizen's arrest. And, of course, it escalated, and it was just ridiculous. And the video there, even that video, which to me, I looked at that and figured, I can't imagine anything that will change how bad this is. It's always awful when someone loses their life. Some of the videos that have been part of this, racial conflict narrative in America have been supplemented or added to, or you get a bigger picture and it changes things. The Ahmaud Arbery case, it was hard to imagine. And even then, we had individuals who clearly coming from a position of racism were trying to explain that away. I haven't really seen. Now, I've actually avoided Twitter in the last couple of days for a number of reasons, mainly for the good of my own heart and soul. Some, but I haven't seen at the same level anyone trying to explain this one away.
Yeah, I agree. It's been almost unanimous, the condemnation.
It has, and it's just so awful. You watch it. I don't know how you watch this and not think. What's interesting, too, is you often have cops in these situations when it involves the conflict involves a police officer and a suspect or something like that ends up deadly. You often have cops defending cops. In this case, everyone seems to condemn this idea.
The Minneapolis
that somehow
police chief fired 4 officers within 24 hours of the video being released. And then the heads of the International Association of Chiefs of Police and the major cities chiefs organization have all, condemned this particular officer's actions. It
was 9 minutes, I think,
right,
that this officer had his knee in the back of the neck of this gentleman, and it ended up costing him his life, even while bystanders are pointing, saying he's unresponsive, he stopped breathing, there's all kinds of things. It's just horrific. It turns some. Here's the other thing too, Shane, that I felt like you're almost guilty for not posting a comment. It was almost like you're expected to post some. I was so disgusted I didn't know what to say. I was so sick to my stomach. I did not know what to say. I don't know what to say, for example, on our BreakPoint commentaries. We talked about that this week. 3.5 minutes. What do you say other than this is awful? There's no room for this on any level. And certainly there's the issue of race that has been brought, I don't say brought into this as if it didn't belong, but the issue of race. But this is just so far beyond the pale, it's hard to know what to say.
Well, I think there's something meaningful in just saying that you condemn this, that this is not behavior we should have in our country. This is not something we should countenance, and this isn't something that should become the heart of a political poo throwing fest. This is, as Chris Brooks, one of our board members at the Colson Center, said on Facebook, he quoted Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who said that silence in the face of evil is itself evil. God will not hold us guiltless. Not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act. And in the midst of something like this, just saying that this is horrific evil, and this transcends any sort of partisan boundaries or any sort of activist agenda, we should all be able to say, at the very least, that no one should be treated this way. An image bearer of God is dead now because of this brutality, and whatever other implications you think that has for society are secondary to the fact that this was wrong. This should never have happened.
Yeah, no question. And it seems to be that this is the consensus that just about everyone's landing on. I mean, again, the explanation to, call Ahmaud Arbery a bad actor in that case is not, I haven't seen that in this one. It's just, it's so heart-wrenching. But it also, we need to spend some time talking about the race issue.
Right.
Because it's getting harder and harder and harder to explain away. As some people are trying to do or have tried to do over the years, this incident and this incident and this incident, it doesn't add up to the fact that we still do have some issues here.
We're missing the whole thing if we don't see this as many see it, which is as the latest in a string of incidents. This is, the latest in a drumbeat of racial injustices. That's how it's received by a huge percentage of the country, and we need to be able to speak to that.
Well, one of the things that broke my heart on this issue years ago, and I think we talked about this a couple weeks ago, but when I looked into this issue at a level that I had not before, having been raised in a largely white community, largely, Southern kind of place, I knew I disagreed on this issue and on all kinds of issues with, liberals, with, even African-American leaders who were politically liberal, religiously liberal, Christian liberals, if you're talking about Jesse Jackson or, Louis Farrakhan or something like that.
Right, the kind of people who say if you don't support the killing of black babies, then you're racist. I mean, that...
Right, yeah. I mean, all kinds of things, disagreements there I could find. But when I realized I disagreed with my friends Carl Ellis and Chris Brooks, it changed things for me. And when, years ago, Chris and I talked about this on a BreakPoint This Week episode where he described the conversations that he had to start having with his children about, when you get pulled over, this is what happened, and this is what you do, and never do this and never do that. And, on the list of important conversations I want to have with my son, that probably is pretty far down the list. For him, it's at the top of the list. And this is at no level trying to say that all cops are bad actors in this.
Right.
I mean, the number of cops condemning this action, for example, are significant. But it does escalate more quickly when it comes to the African American community. It does. And are there back reasons for that? Are there, extenuating facts? Is there a history in America? The answer to all of that is yes. And at the same time, it escalates more quickly when it comes to African Americans. And that's something that has to be addressed.
Well, whatever else the disagreements we may have with organizations like Black Lives Matter, which there should be some pretty substantial disagreements for all Christians. If you look at their stated agenda, we should be able to recognize that those who, even like Colin Kaepernick, there's an eerie resemblance, almost like a foreshadowing of this particular incident and the way, he took a knee during the national anthem. And his intent there, whatever you think of it, was to protest what he saw as a systemic racism issue in regards to police brutality. And so that's going to be reinforced now just immensely. And we're going to have to be able to deal with it as the church. We're going to have to be able to speak credibly to our African American brothers and sisters and show that we really do care. We're speaking as two white guys here. I think we need to take this very seriously.
Look, I can disagree with Colin Kaepernick on a number of issues, and I do.
Of course.
I can be, for example, disagree on kind of how I think politics should work and how all of this works out. And, I can disagree with him on a number of issues and still think that I should listen right now more than I should talk. And it just comes back. I was speaking to this morning, even Shane, of a friend who runs another organization that's not unlike ours, and just the need again. It just seems to come back to this: to walk and chew gum at the same time right now.
Right.
I can, for example, believe desperately that there are extenuating circumstances, and that the rioting that has happened in response to this is wrong and awful. and doesn't help the cause whatsoever. And it actually is a disrespect of the life that was lost. I can believe all of that, right, and still think what this police officer did was wrong, and still believe in the goodness of a whole lot of police officers, and still believe, by the way, that not all police officers are perfect, and that, not all suspects are perfect, and there might be extenuating circumstances, and that this, what was it, forgery? Is it something that solicits the death penalty? I can believe all of that. Like, we've got to learn to hold all of this together and say that there's this has got to stop.
You don't get on a team other than the team of truth. We're being called to do this a lot today, it seems, with this issue, with the coronavirus, where you can say, yes, I care about the millions now who are filing jobless claims, and I also care about those who are sick and dying in hospitals because of this virus. You don't have to pick a side. You can care about both and then work forward in the issue.
Yeah, it is getting harder and harder and harder, and I think unless we continue to come back to the fundamentals, where we start as Christians, every single person is made in the image of God. This victim, this person who died too soon, is made in the image of God. The police officer that made a terrible mistake, made in the image of God. And I don't know how you even begin to process this outside of this. We also had... I want to come to the other story that was initially told alongside this one, but it seems to pale in comparison to this one at any sort of level, which is the story of, I guess the popular title is the Central Park Karen, where here you have a New Yorker who is called out for not having her dog on the leash, responded really poorly, and actually called the police, basically threatening, hey, there's an African-American man after me trying to kill me, which obviously wasn't true. Trying to actually intimidate the African-American man by threatening to bring the police to him. And not just because the police intimidate all of us, but particularly because of the history there. I mean, it was just ridiculous. And then you had, that escalated quickly too. She lost her dog. She lost her job. She's the most, hated person on Twitter other than this police officer. And can I also believe at the same time that the Twitter shaming of people, that she did something really dumb and wrong, and maybe it was out of a racist impulse, maybe it was she had a really bad 30 minutes that, if my worst 30 minutes were put on Twitter, I'd be embarrassed too. And she did it horribly, and what she did was a racist act. But I'm not sure she can show her face in New York City again. The escalation of things right now is so quick. How do we explain that?
Well, which is why we need to be careful, to remember that each person is a moral agent and someone worthy of, respect and dignity and consideration in the midst of a culture that wants to do everything, trial by social media style. And in some instances, it's just so clear that something incredibly wrong was done, as is the case with the George Floyd incident, the same with this Central Park incident. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we are entitled to do justice as a social media mob. And we have to be careful in our response to that, not to, as what did Rivera say, that she was crucified or flogged or something along those lines by a social media mob. And it harkens back to the whole Justine Sacco case years ago, where this woman's life was ruined while she was on the plane across the Atlantic because of a tweet that was actually misunderstood. And then, she got fired and her whole life was changed. And now it'll never be the same because of this Twitter shaming. So we got to walk and chew gum at the same time on a whole lot of different levels here. We also have to take a quick break. We'll be right back, folks, to talk about more of the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. Stay with us.
We invite you to visit BreakPoint.org, and while you're at our website, be sure to browse our online Colson Center store of books and other resources, and you can find links to our social media sites like Facebook and Twitter.
We're back on BreakPoint this week talking about the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. And John, one of the things that we mentioned in the last segment was the catastrophic economic ruin that's been wrought by, the coronavirus and the shutdowns subsequent to that. And we have a new report out this week that more than 40 million people, the equivalent of 1 out of every 4 American workers, have actually filed for unemployment benefits since mid-March at this stage. This is just an astonishing tally that actually, according to experts, rivals resembles the bleakest years of the Great Depression. And people are continuing to lose their jobs, and it's just continuing to sort of escalate. The government has actually reported that as of Thursday, 2.1 million people had filed unemployment claims just in the last week. The devastation is tremendous, and I'm not sure that we're ready to even deal with it, to grapple with the human cost of this virus and our efforts to control it.
Oh, listen, we're going to continue to feel this for a long time.
Years.
I think it has to do with what we said early on, that what we have to think about are both lives and livelihoods, and as the trajectory of what we come to know about this virus changes almost all the time, and I think there's a number of things that are creating a situation that it's just a bad combination. And we talked earlier this week on BreakPoint about the pre-existing conditions of the coronavirus. In other words, the things that were already deeply in place that this is just making worse. So, for example, the loneliness, the epidemic of loneliness, the deaths from despair. A doctor famously said this week, it turned out to be not statistically completely accurate, but that there were more deaths at the hospital he worked at from suicide than COVID-19. I don't think it turned out to be true or exactly right at his hospital, but I think we're going to have plenty of hospitals across America where that is the case. I know, for example, what I'm hearing from folks in kind of emergency response here in Colorado Springs and El Paso County, that they are dealing with an awful lot more calls in terms of overdoses. And then, of course, suicide. And, this is connected. I've thought from the very beginning that this phrase, unessential worker, non-essential worker. No work is non-essential for a family. No husband's job is non-essential. No husband's job is non-essential for their wife and children and for their own well-being and for, parents that they have to care for or anything else. And so this has just been look, I go in and say none of this was nefarious. I don't think that there's a conspiracy theory around this, but there's a lot of ways we've messed this one up. And I think we can, give people the benefit of the doubt that they tried real hard, but the devastation here and the unwillingness of some, I think now we're seeing such a incredibly unwise move from some governors, state officials, to refuse to open up at any level and to do so in kind of crazy ways. Yeah. Look, hindsight's 20/20. I get it. You figure it out looking back. Here's what we should have done. And no one knew. We were making things up on the fly. But I think there is an attitude about work, an attitude about worship, an attitude about community that's being exposed in all of this. And those are attitudes, I think, fundamentally that'll have to change.
It's also helped for me to realize, John, that a lot of the anger and sort of strong opinions on this are due to circumstances on the ground. They're due to loss of jobs and inability to make rent and feed families. This is, of course, it's going to excite passions. Of course, it's going to give people the feeling that they need to have a really strong opinion on this. And because of that, we need to have extra grace with one another. There was actually a really great article I read by Stephen Klugowitz, I think that's how you say his name, at The Imaginative Conservative, and it was called Magnanimity, the Balm for Our Brutalized Public Discourse. And it was a review of the fact that being gentle with someone and making it clear that you're on their side and you're trying to move in the same direction, toward mutual understanding and well-being is actually how you convert people to your cause. It's actually how you get people to, understand what you're saying and not to put down their arms. But we're just catastrophically lacking that in our current, especially with social media, our current discourse.
So this is my question, Shane, because I think that's such a good point. And we go back to the story that we began with, which is the story of the week, which is the most awful thing any of us have seen for, at least a while. And you think, why are things escalating so quickly? And that's to a degree where someone lost their life unjustly and just awful, awful stuff. But it just does. This week in El Paso County here in Colorado Springs, an initial draft of directives from the local county commissioners to churches about reopening was sent to pastors. And so I read it, and I just read through it, and I thought, if everything they said in this document is correct, which it wasn't, if every recommendation was a good one, which it wasn't, but even if it was, the tone that they're using to churches, you shall do this, you shall not do this. When it comes to communion, you can't do this. We had the same thing. What was it? I just saw this week. I think it was in maybe the state of Maryland, where the governor says any food or drink, including those used for religious purposes or something like that, can't be served in church. And you're like, elected officials, first of all, don't understand what they're talking about when it comes to this worship. And secondly, it's the attitude and the tone brought into the conversation. It seems to be a real infection, doesn't it? I mean, how quickly could this situation with this police officer and this man in Minneapolis have been de-escalated? How quickly could it have been de-escalated? How quickly could the tensions between, the citizens and Christians of Illinois and the governor there be de-escalated if there would just be a change in tone?
Yeah, tone is not just style. It's not just delivery. How we speak to one another or how we act toward one another.
It's an attitude.
It says a great deal about how we view one another, about whether we're actually valuable and worth talking to and worth considering.
I go back to the National Prayer Breakfast and Arthur Brooks's terrific speech at the National Prayer Breakfast, which caused a lot of people to be grumpy. But, he talked about that idea of scorn, just this sense that it's just a sense that people aren't worthy of our attention or people aren't worthy of our respect.
I might call it flippancy. I might quote the Screwtape Letters and call it flippancy. Screwtape says that there's no finer armor against the enemy that you can build up around a man's soul than to make him flippant. And the enemy, of course, in that context being God.
Being God, right.
You become a scoffer and angry and hateful toward everyone you talk with. It's just, that's the state we are in so many different contexts right now in our culture.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to take a quick break, folks, and we'll be right back after this to talk about more of the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. By the way, if you want to see the stories that we're talking about this week, if you need links to them, come to breakpoint.org, and we'll tell you how you can access all of those. Stay with us.
You can learn more about BreakPoint and the Colson Center for Christian Worldview when you visit breakpoint.org. That's breakpoint.org.
We're back on BreakPoint this week, talking about the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. John, another one that sort of harkened back to my high school days this week. We had the lead singer of Hawk Nelson, John Steingard, who's been the frontman for quite some time now as they've become more popular on Christian radio. He came out on Twitter and said that, or not Twitter, it was Instagram, and said that he no longer believes in God. He's abandoning the Christian faith. And it was just sort of eerily similar to a whole slew of Instagram apostasies that we've seen from Christian celebrities in recent days. The themes were so similar. The notes he hit were just eerily reminiscent of stuff we've seen before. And it makes me wonder, is there a script somewhere for, coming out as an atheist or an unbeliever as a Christian celebrity? I don't get where the similarity is coming from here.
Well, first of all, there's a phrase called Instagram apostasy. Just the fact that
I don't know if it's original to me or you.
But is that right? I'm pretty sure it's you. I think
okay,
I've seen it around. I think it's caught on, but it's certainly a thing. There's so much to talk about. I thought Sean McDowell wrote a terrific article. Sean, of course, is speaking as well for our Truth Love Together event, and he addresses some of the doubts and concerns that John Steingard actually mentioned, which brings up at least one part of this that we should talk about. But Sean specifically addressed this, and I thought he did a terrific job. First of all, not coming from a place of scorn, and we talked in our team this week that it's really hard because why is it that someone actually struggles with this? He admitted himself that the band wasn't really together anymore, at least hadn't performed in quite some time, and yet let me still go on Instagram to tell everyone. Why? Well, I mean, what's the point of that? Why make a big announcement of it? We talked about in Josh Harris's case, for example, why hire a photographer to have a wistful photo looking out into, the middle distance? What's really going on with that? That says a lot more about kind of the cultural context of celebrity and so on. It also says something about how it's easy to get a following with this sort of a story, either denying Christianity or denying some essential aspect of Christian truth and still calling yourself a Christian. We've seen both of those situations and both of those scenarios happen. This is sad, though. I don't want to question the sincerity of his doubt.
Of course, yeah.
And so on. But
we don't know you pointed out in a meeting we had this week that we don't know all that's going on behind the scenes, and we rarely do with this sort of thing. That objections that get put out there, like, science has disproved God, or why do good things happen to, or bad things happen to good people, which, by the way, are all included in his Instagram post. Sometimes they're not really, the real reason. Sometimes they're fronts or excuses for what is actually happening behind the scenes. And we don't know this guy's heart, so we're not sure,
No, we don't. I mean, but a couple things to say is those are the go-to questions, right? Why is the Old Testament God different than the New Testament God? Why does God let bad things happen? These aren't new questions, as Sean wrote this week. These are pretty old questions. There's been an awful lot of people that have answered these questions and answered them thoroughly and answered them well. And if you need answers to these questions, those answers are actually out there. And so it's either a situation where he's saying something that's not true. In other words, he's saying, these are my doubts, but really there's something else going on. My experience with students, and I know he's an adult, so that may or may not be the same thing. My experience with students is the intellectual questions are almost always connected or a smokescreen for moral failures or moral struggles. Struggling with sexual orientation, struggling with some sort of deep addiction or something like that, or a father wound or, something along those lines. So it's either that or it's really sad because he is describing a situation in which he had these questions and he didn't feel like he could actually doubt out loud. Right. I'm really grateful, by the way, for Brett Kunkle, my co-author in A Practical Guide to Culture. There's a whole chapter and a whole section in that book about doubt, because you got to doubt well. And Proverbs makes a distinction, for example, between the one who's seeking and doubting and the one who's a scoffer and doubting. And it's a very important distinction. So either it's sad because he grew up in a situation where he couldn't ask those questions, or he did ask those questions and they didn't have the answers, which is sad because there's answers.
Yeah, the context he was in might not have had the answers, so it's premature to say that he just didn't seek them out. Maybe he did.
Yeah, who knows?
But you can't read the first 5 chapters of a Lee Strobel book without getting answers to those very questions, and I think they're very good answers too. And if someone doesn't think they are, then I'd like to talk to them. But there are.
But there's an attitude here too, Shane, that we need to talk about. If you're a mentor or a youth pastor and you don't allow the question, what the student hears is Christianity can't handle it. In other words, if you are mentoring and pointing someone to Christ, and the impression that they get is every time they ask a tough question about the faith, you dismiss it or say, just have faith or whatever, ultimately what the impression that they get is that Christianity is not a big enough worldview to handle the bigger questions, which is really sad.
Yeah. And that sort of meshes with what Steingart said. Like he said that he felt that he had to put on a show for people for a long time and just pretend that he still believed, even though he had these festering doubts in his heart and in his mind, just sort of undermining his Christian faith. We need to be able to have. I've just looked at an email. A friend sent me this long email that he received from someone in Germany based on a blog post that he'd put up. And this guy was talking about all the doubts that he's had. And he was really doubting well. He said, this is the objection that I've encountered about the Bible, about the reliability of the Old Testament accounts, about whether we can trust what the apostles said in the New Testament. And I want to rebuild my faith. Help me rebuild my faith and tell me what the resources are. That was a beautiful example of doubting well. And we need to be able to cultivate and encourage that instead of have this environment where it's discouraged, at least implicitly.
Yeah, I mean, look, you can't hide kids from the questions forever. In fact, it used to be that I could play the devil's advocate with the youth group and bring up things they'd never heard before, but they've all seen Richard Dawkins videos or Bart Ehrman debates or, memes from the Village Atheist, with a little, nugget here or there, and planting seeds of doubt. I do think, I'm convinced, and it's why we started the Truth Love Together event talking about truth, which was a wonderful module. I'm so excited about the contributions that Sean and Abdu and Oz Guinness and Brett made to that lineup, and Natasha. And I think Natasha, brings this out as well, that if the part of discipling kids for the 21st century is helping them ask questions and helping them to do it well. It's going to be part of that. We got some resources on that, by the way, at breakpoint.org.
Well, folks, as part of our new format, we're going to play for you another clip from our Truth Love Together virtual event, this time from Module 3. You're about to hear from Max Mclean, the talent behind a whole collection of powerful one-man stage productions, as well as audio Bibles. This one is from his production, C.S. Lewis, The Most Reluctant Convert.
One day, Tolkien and I took a stroll on Addison's Walk. As we talked, I said, Tollers, I have, with considerable resistance, come to believe in God. But not Christianity. I simply cannot believe something I do not understand. How can the life and death of someone else, whoever he was, 2,000 years ago, help us here and now? Tollers answered, Jack, when you meet a God sacrificing himself in a pagan story such as Dionysius or Balder or even a fairy tale, you like it very much and are mysteriously moved by it, provided you meet it anywhere except in the Gospels. Jack, the story of Christ is a myth working on us in the same way as other myths, with one tremendous difference. It really happened. Suddenly, a rush of wind interrupted us startlingly. So many leaves fell to the ground, I thought it was raining. I held my breath. Tollers and I talked deep into the night. Hugo Dyson joined us. They convinced me that nothing else in all literature is just like the Gospels, and that no person is like the person they depicted. When I would bring this up, my colleagues would say, Jack, I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I simply cannot accept his claim to be God. Well, how could a mere man be called a great moral teacher and say the sorts of things Jesus said? That he always existed, that he will come again to judge the world. Chesterton wrote that no great moral teacher ever claimed to be God. Not Moses, not Muhammad, not Plato, not Buddha, not one. If you had gone to Buddha and asked, are you the son of Brahma? He would have said, my son, you are still in the veil of illusion. If you had gone to Socrates and asked, are you Zeus? He would have laughed at you. And if you had gone to Muhammad and asked, are you Allah? He would first tear his clothes, then cut your head off. No great moral teacher ever made that claim, except Jesus. And he went on claiming to forgive sins, and that he himself is the injured party in every transgression. In anyone else, this would be thought silly. Suppose you told me that two of your colleagues had lost you a professorship by telling lies about your character, and I replied, I freely forgive them both. Oh, would you not think that sheer lunacy? And yet even those who opposed him admitted that he expressed moral truth with depth and purity, full of wisdom and shrewdness. He calls himself humble and meek, and we believe him, not noticing that humility and meekness are the last things you would ascribe to a man who makes claims worthy of a megalomaniac. Kirk taught me to shame inconsistency. If Jesus' statements are false, Christianity is of no importance. If true, it is of infinite importance. The one thing it cannot be is moderately important. Oh, I felt a resistance to this, almost as strong as my resistance to theism. Every step from the absolute to spirit to God was a step toward the more concrete. And now, to accept the incarnation, that God became man, was a further step in the same direction. This too was something I had not wanted. I remember very well when, but hardly how, the final step was taken. I was being driven by my brother Warney to Whipsnade Zoo in the sidecar of a motorcycle one sunny morning in the autumn of 1931. When we set out, I did not believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. When we reached the zoo, I did. I had not spent the journey in thought or great emotion. It was more like a man who, after long sleep, has become aware he is now awake. My conversion shed new light on my search for joy. The overwhelming longings that emerged from fantasies and my brother's toy garden were merely signposts to what I really desired. They were not the thing itself. I concluded that if I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world could satisfy, the most probable explanation is I was made for another world. The faint, far-off results of those energies which God's creative rapture implanted in matter when He made the worlds are what we now call physical pleasures. And even thus filtered, they are too much for our present management. What will it be like to taste at the fountainhead that stream of delight which even the smallest drop proves so intoxicating? That, I now believe, is what lies before us. We are to drink joy at the fountain of joy. At present, we're on the outside of that world, the wrong side of the door. We cannot mingle with the splendors we see. But all the leaves, the New Testament rustling with the rumor that it will not always be so. One day, God willing, we shall get in.
That was a selection from Max Mclean's C.S. Lewis, The Most Reluctant Convert. You can hear more in Module 3 of our free online event, Truth, Love, Together. Just come to conference.colsoncenter.org to register and get access to all of the amazing talks and discussions we're hosting. We're back for our Q&A session here at the tail end of our weekly podcast. John, we've got a number of questions this week that some of them we didn't get to last week, some of them are new, and I think they're really interesting. And this format is exciting to me because it allows us to get off of our familiar tracks and scripts and just sort of interact with our listeners and talk about what's concerning them. What are they thinking about? What are the questions they have?
It's really a lot of fun, isn't it? I mean, look, even in this during this whole kind of pandemic, shutdown orders, we've heard so much more from so many more of our folks. It's almost amazing.
Like they're shut in. in and with
yeah, it's
nothing
like,
to do.
I don't have anything else to do. I'm not going to call my mom again, so I'm going to call the Colson Center. But it's actually been really wonderful. And it also helps us to clarify. I mean, we started out this podcast talking about this awful story of the week. And we had somebody kind of reach out and say, you guys have to say something. And part of it is listen, you might have missed 2 weeks ago when we talked about Ahmaud Arbery. We did talk about that story. They specifically mentioned that in their question. And sometimes the timing of it and even the topic itself means rather than trying to tackle it in 3.5 minutes, it's way better to talk about it here. You and I were able to talk about, for example, this Minnesota story, this awful story for 12 minutes, which is
right.
Way better to just kind of mourn. And there are biblical responses to evil that are just lament. And that's how I felt. I mean, look, if you want me to explain exactly what happened and why and what that means about all of us, I'm not sure that I can tell you some things. Everybody's a sinner. The line of good and evil does not run between people groups, but right down the middle of the human heart. And I'm a sinner too. And the world's broken, and sometimes things are that bad we just cry out. And that this was a lamentable story in my mind, but it's helped us also, I guess, back to my original point, which is, this sort of interaction has helped us explain kind of what the schedule is. And sometimes even radio keeps us from being able to get something on, and it's better for us to talk about it here.
Okay, so with that, I've got a hot potato. I'm going to throw your way and just see what you do with it, okay? So this is a question a listener sent in. And I've kind of titled it, What About Divorce and Men? Because this is really interesting and it's controversial. This listener says, the discussion about low birth rates and childlessness was so typical of so much of evangelical critique. Ouch. Never do you guys mention that the threat of being dragged through divorce court in a messy process where they're almost always certain to lose substantially, and that this is men, this person speaking about. Men do not want to risk marriage and having children that can easily be taken from them. Please don't merely attribute it to selfishness or immaturity. Sure, those are factors, but it's complete cultural blindness to leave out the threat of divorce and its impact. So men aren't getting married because the threat of divorce in our society. Go.
Well, first, it's just not true that we never mention, because we do mention it. And I've actually specifically talked about this in front of crowds. And it's one of the, and also on BreakPoint, and also on BreakPoint this week. In other words, sometimes people think that because we didn't mention it this time, we never mention it. And that's just not true. Secondly, if anyone has talked about the impact of divorce across the board, we have. I think, though, since the topic came up, it's worth mentioning. Two parts of this, Shane, and I'd love for you to weigh in on this too. The first part is, if you were to stack up the devastation that's happened because of the breakdown of the family, on one hand, these are the men scared of divorce over here. And then over here, put, in terms of scale, men who are perpetual adolescents, never grow up because they're addicted to gaming and didn't have fathers of their own and all of that sort of stuff. And you put them on a scale and said, which problem right now is worse? Look, we have a crisis of masculinity. Now, maybe this crisis of masculinity over here means that men are boys and they're scared of divorce and all of that sort of thing. And I certainly think those men exist. Don't get me wrong. But listen, 90% of the problems that men have can be handled by taking responsibility for their own lives, not blaming the system. And by the way, in the spirit of walk and chew gum at the same time, I can believe that and know that to be true, and still say, right now, yes, we do have a real problem where the court system oftentimes is weighted against men. Men often struggle to stay in their kids' lives for various things. It's not a great system. And also that, as my pastor says, the number of between men and women seeking divorce, in his experience in the last 5 years, more women are seeking divorce than men.
Well, that's statistically verifiable.
Right.
Women initiate the majority of divorces for whatever reason. I mean, you can't just say that.
No, that's not to say. Yeah, that's right. Variety of reasons. I mean, maybe because they're addicted. Men are addicted to porn. Maybe because women found a love with somebody else. In other words, it's a whole big broken mess. But I think a large part of the problem could be solved if we had fathers in homes. And at some generations, it's just got to start, like, be a man. We're a culture that rewards adolescence forever, and it's a bad situation. But you might disagree.
Well, I actually agree with you. My thoughts on this are that
you say that surprisingly. Well, surprisingly, I agree.
Surprisingly, no. We have our disagreements on certain things, but this is not one of them. I think the thing I would add, John, is that I suspect this listener is seeing something that's actually downstream from the real problem, which is no-fault divorce. So I think it was who was it at Public Discourse who wrote a lot about this issue, about why marriage can't be privatized and no-fault divorce doesn't work. But the basic idea is that, okay, if you allow people to just end a marriage for any reason, the whole structure falls apart because the incentives are all out of whack. Traditionally, marriage is designed to bind men and women together and then to create presumptive paternity, because there's no question about maternity ever. You know who had the baby. But there's always been throughout history a question of paternity. And so marriage creates the presumption that the husband is the father of any children. Well, unfortunately, when you have no-fault divorce, where there doesn't need to be a recognition of infidelity or failure on one spouse's part, they can just go their separate ways for any reason, and unilaterally, I would add. The incentives are all out of whack. You no longer have that binding agreement. It doesn't function the same way. Mm-hmm. And so as a result, men look at marriage, look at no-fault divorce oftentimes, and I think they rightly say, what's in it for me? What is the deal here? Because there's no binding permanency to this institution. It's completely, it's fallen apart. And that's something that, the Reagan conservative movement has a lot to answer for on, because that was where a lot of this no-fault divorce stuff began. The second thing...
Well, to Reagan's credit, he did say it was the worst legislative decision he ever made.
Yeah, he recognized that after the fact. He recognized that. And then you mentioned the court system as a result being weighted against men. I think the third factor that I would bring into this is that the government, I think Thomas Sowell wrote about this, the government has become a replacement husband for many, many women and many, many mothers. And it's allowed a sort of leniency in the divorce process that wouldn't have been there otherwise, because a husband was a necessary provider. Well, now a husband is sort of an unnecessary accessory for many people, because the government is going to step in and be the replacement husband and provider. And that introduces a new perverse incentive, to borrow a phrase, I think also from Sowell. So the whole mess that we're looking at is a lot more complicated than just the system being stacked against men in the courts.
Oh, look, the sexual revolution has all kinds of victims, and men are among the victims of the sexual revolution. But if you want to weight it up, women and children have been far more victimized. Men, in many ways, have been given the get-out-of-jail-free card. And they've been given perverse incentives. And if you don't have character, if you're not raised in virtue, if you don't have a dad in the home, oftentimes, or a heroic single-parent mom that can actually teach you those sorts of things, and you embrace them, right? It's a tough math problem.
Good answer.
Yeah.
Good answer. Incomplete from both of us, but good. Hopefully that's the beginning of a helpful
conversation. But we have talked about this, for the record. We have talked about this.
Of course.
Maybe I'm a little on edge. I'm not on edge at all, but this is, again, when people say you guys never talk about this, but we do, and we have. And, we don't always talk about everything all the time. And that's, radio.
Well, to be honest, John, sometimes I'll be like, why haven't we talked about this? And then, our editor will Tim will send me over a link and say, no, we did talk about this last week. Here's the link. Okay. All right. I missed that. All right. We've got one more question here I want to get to. And this is one that a lot of people have. This goes back to the Hawk Nelson lead singer who, apostatized on Instagram. This is a question that a lot of people give for leaving the Christian faith. And so this parent wants to know, could you make a book recommendation? My son is wrestling with how can God be good if he created everything and evil, which is included among everything, exist. That means he created evil, right? So how can I trust him? I know my son believes, and I really think he's a Christian, but he's almost 18 and he's wrestling with it all for himself for the first time. I appreciate any help you can offer.
This is actually a question that was dealt with in one of our more recent What Would You Say videos, which is a new video series that the Colson Center has produced on YouTube and also at whatwouldyousay.org. And this was one of the questions, which is, how can, God be good if he created everything and evil exists, therefore he created evil? That's assuming something, that evil itself is a created thing. Not everything that exists is a created thing. Some things that exist because they are parasitic, or they are lacks of something that does exist. For example,
privation.
It's a privation, yeah, which is, a big polysyllabic word. But yeah, exactly. It's, cold. Cold's not really a created thing. Heat is, and the lack of heat is cold. Darkness is not a created thing. Light is, but then the lack of light is dark. The same thing is true when it comes, to evil. That evil itself is the privation, a parasite on the good. And this is something that I think has to be walked through carefully, but it makes sense, when you do it. Doesn't mean everyone embraces it, right? This goes back to our conversation about, internet apostasy or Instagram apostasy, which is, sometimes the stated reasons and the real reasons aren't always the same thing. But, there's also the other side of the problem of evil, which is it's often assumed that evil is only a problem for Christians or for theists. Why can God let this happen? But every religion, every worldview has to explain evil. Not only explain that evil exists, but explain that we experience evil in the way that we do.
Right.
And if there is no God, if the universe is a complete accident, then there's no such thing as evil. In other words, there's no such thing as this ought not be. There's only what is. And so therefore, the worst thing that ever happened to you, including the worst things that we can see, including that horrible event that happened in Minnesota this week, is an accident. There was no cause, no purpose, no meaning. There's no answer to it. In fact, you can't even really say that there's anything wrong with it.
Right. Well, if you embrace naturalism and we're just animals, well, guess what animals do to each other all the time? Terrible things.
That's right. But even more than that, there's not even categories of good and evil in the universe, right? It's not just that we're animals, so therefore we behave like animals, but there's not even a category of good and evil that we can go to. Right. Lewis said, if the universe had no meaning, we should have never figured out that it had no meaning, right? In other words, in such a universe, why do we have these sorts of thoughts? The very fact that we have these sorts of thoughts implies that there's something that's part of the universe of the world or the human heart that senses these things. And
in
that
a truly meaningless universe, there shouldn't be nihilists and they shouldn't drink as much.
There you go. Well, our questioner asked for a book recommendation. We deal with this in chapter 6 of our book, Making Sense of Your World, and we try to hit this from a number of different angles. There's also the most recent book, which is Evil and the Cross. Sorry, I'm thinking of another book. Where is God in a Coronavirus World by John Lennox, which is really quite good as well. And then there's some wonderful treatments of evil and suffering on the website STR, which is for our friends at Stand to Reason, str.org, that hits the various aspects, including a really good explanation of this idea that evil isn't really a thing in the sense that it's a created thing. Mm-hmm. Not everything that exists was created. That's so in other words, the syllogism, God created everything, evil's a thing, therefore God created evil. The first two premises need to be understood, are inaccurate the way that they're stated on a purely logical level.
And I think we need to acknowledge our debt here to C.S. Lewis, because we're basically following the outline of his argument in Mere Christianity, among other places, about the objection from evil against the existence of God. Of course, he came up with the saying that if the universe were meaningless, we would have never figured it out. He came up with another saying that atheism turns out to be too simple, because the atheist can't explain the very idea of evil, which he uses to object to God. But then Lewis turns around, of course, and he gives his own sort of theodicy. That's another 50-cent word for how you explain evil in light of God. And he says that essentially evil is the price of a universe with truly free creatures who have meaningful ability to choose right and wrong, and so therefore they can choose wrong. Well, if you allow for angels, you allow for if you create angels who are free, you allow for devils. If you create human beings who are free, then you allow for unbelief, and that's and of course everything that goes with unbelief, evil,
and bad
sin,
actors,
rebellion, bad actors, and so that is. That's the beginning of a really powerful and effective answer, I think, to that question on an intellectual level. Of course, it's not always intellectual. Sometimes it's also a much more visceral objection. It's and I don't think that intellectual answers are necessarily the best response in that case. A lot of times, just acknowledging the hurt that's involved and pointing to the cross, pointing to Christ, the suffering God, is the best response there. And so that takes wisdom. You have to determine exactly what you're dealing with there. In this particular instance, it may be that this student has some particular evil or pain or grief or loss in mind, and that's something that you need to discern as a parent, and that we need to discern as fellow Christians and pastors and teachers, etc.
Yeah, that's a really important distinction. Sometimes people ask an intellectual question, and what they're really asking is, make me feel better, get this hurt away from me. And this is why the ultimate answer to evil and suffering lands at the cross. And there's a really wonderful theological treatment of this called Evil and the Cross, which does this. It's a little bit more heady, a little bit more of an academic book, but it lands you there. As did, by the way, Ravi Zacharias in a number of lectures. And so that's another place I would point, where which you can find at the rzim.org. And we'll link to all this at breakpoint.org.
Well, John, thanks so much for this time. This is a really fun conversation, a really fun segment, and I hope we can continue it. But that depends on you folks. We need you to drop us a line at breakpoint.org over there in the contact section, or link up with us on Facebook or Twitter, and you can ask your questions there, and our editor will send them over to us, and we'll see if we can get them on the show here and offer the beginnings of some answers to them. Thanks for listening. For John Stonestreet and for the Colson Center, I'm Shane Morris.